ब्रह्मनाथ ओ शांति 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 स्वस्थ। Hello students, in the previous class we discussed about the introduction portion of the breathing and the respiration. We discussed that the respiration is one of the vital activity or processes that are carrying out, or we can say that are going inside the animal's body. Next we discussed that the respiration is defined as the series of the chemical reaction where the oxidation of the food takes place. Okay. Next, we discussed that in the case of the respiration, it is something different from the breathing. Breathing is not similar to respiration. We can say, instead we can say that the breathing is the first step of the respiration. Okay, because breathing is a physical activity, whereas the respiration is a biochemical activity or process. Okay. Breathing is the physical activity in which the oxygen is being received and carbon dioxide is being eliminated. So it is simply we can say a physical state or a process. But respiration means it is a biochemical process. So we can say breathing and respiration are two different phenomena. But yes, the breathing is, we can say that the breathing is the first step of the respiration. Okay. Next, we discussed that on the basis of the availability of the oxygen, the respiration is divided into two types. One is your aerobic respiration, other one is your anaerobic respiration. Obviously, if oxygen is used, then the type of respiration is known as your aerobic respiration. If the oxygen is not used, then the type of respiration is known as your anaerobic respiration. Further also, we discussed so many points under the aerobic respiration. And for your extra knowledge, we discussed that the aerobic respiration is of two types, direct aerobic respiration and the indirect aerobic respiration. Then we discussed details about the anaerobic respiration. Anaerobic respiration is also known as your fermentation process. And also on the basis of the end product, the fermentation process is divided into two types. One is your alcoholic fermentation, other one is your acidic fermentation. If the end product is, we can say, ethyl alcohol, then it is your alcoholic fermentation. If the end product is acid, or we can say lactic acid for example, or we can say lactic acid, then in that case the type of respiration or the type of fermentation is known as your acidic fermentation. And lastly, we discussed the difference between the anaerobic respiration and the aerobic respiration. Okay, we discussed so many points such as oxygen in the case of the anaerobic is not used, aerobic it is used. In the case of the anaerobic, less energy is produced, such as we can say 2 ATP molecules are produced in the anaerobic respiration, and in the case of the aerobic respiration 38 ATP molecules of energy is produced, which is, we can say, more energy is produced. Okay, so this much we have discussed in our previous class. Today students will discuss the type of respiration, but according to the respiratory organ. See, obviously respiratory organs means what? The organs which helps in carrying out the process of the respiration. Those are called your respiratory organs. Okay. Students, according to the respiratory organs, there are basically 4 types of the respiration. Okay. First one is the cutaneous respiration, then is your branchial respiration, then is your tracheal respiration, and lastly the pulmonary respiration. In the cutaneous respiration, the respiratory organ is generally the skin. Next, in the branchial respiration, generally the respiratory organ is your gills. In the third one, that is your tracheal respiration, the respiratory organ is trachea. And the last one, that is your pulmonary respiration. The respiratory organ is the lungs, which is in our case. Okay. So today we'll discuss two type of respiration. Firstly, we'll discuss in detail about the cutaneous respiration. Next, we'll discuss the second one, that is your branchial respiration. Okay. So let's discuss first the cutaneous respiration. As I said you students, that in the case of the cutaneous respiration, the respiratory organ is the skin. So we can write our first point, that is, in the case of the cutaneous respiration, the respiration is done by the moist skin. Okay. First point, respiration is, simply we can write, respiration is by moist skin. Okay. Always the skin, the moist skin. Why we say the moist skin? We can see here the diagram, students. See, this one is your skin having various layers. Okay, these are the various opening of the mucous gland from where the various secretion takes place. Here you can see a thin film of water is there, which provides generally the moisture to the skin. So we can simply say the thin film of water and also the opening of the mucous gland which secretes various secretion, they keep the skin moist, by which it plays an important role in the case of the carrying out the process of the respiration. How it is helping, I will tell you, don't worry. Okay, so first point, the respiration is being done by the moist skin. The cutaneous respiration is generally seen in the case of the leech, earthworm, in some fishes and also in the frogs. But in the case of the hibernation period, hibernation means the winter sleep. Okay, so we can write our next point. It is found in case of generally the earthworm, the leech. You have observed that in the case of the earthworm, leech, they have we can say a slimy like secretion of the skin. Okay, because they respire by the skin. Earthworm, leech, then earthworm, leech, some fishes. Okay, next in the frog's case also, frog's case during the hibernation. Okay, hibernation means, students, the winter sleep. Okay, etc. Okay, next point, how the respiration is being generally done, students. See, the atmospheric oxygen, okay, the atmospheric oxygen, it is dissolved in the thin film of water. You can see here a thin film of water is there. The oxygen means the atmospheric oxygen is simply present in the dissolved form in the case of the thin film of water. Okay, from where the oxygen will be entered into the, or we can say into the tissue. I'll tell you in detail, don't worry. So our next point, atmospheric oxygen is dissolved in the thin film of water. Okay, in the thin film of water. Okay. Next, the oxygen, okay, from this dissolved oxygen, the oxygen then enters into the blood. What is this? These are the blood capillary in which the blood is being flowing. So the oxygen enters into the blood and bound with the oxygen carrying pigment. Okay, bound with the oxygen carrying pigment such as your hemoglobin, hemocyanin, hemoerythrit, etc. In our case, hemoglobin. So we can write our next point. Oxygen enters into the blood and bound with the oxygen carrying pigment, okay, such as your hemoglobin, hemocyanin, in different organisms different pigments are there, hemocyanin, hemoerythrin, etc. Okay, so what happened now? The oxygen is being entered into the blood and it is bound with the oxygen carrying pigment. Next, what happens? After the bound of the oxygen with the pigment, it forms an unstable structure, or we can say compound, it becomes more unstable, by which it enters into the tissue and release the oxygen. Let's write the point first. After bound to the pigment, or we can write after the oxygen is bound to the pigment, after the oxygen is bound to the pigment, it becomes highly unstable. It becomes highly unstable. Okay, and then enters into the tissue and release the oxygen and becomes free. Okay, see what happens? After the oxygen is being bound with the oxygen carrying pigment, what happens? It becomes highly unstable. As soon as it becomes bound to the, we can say, the pigment, it becomes highly unstable. It means as soon as it is being bound, it want to release the oxygen somewhere. So what it does? The oxygen, that structure with that is the unstable structure which is bound with the oxygen and the pigment. What happens? It enters into the tissue where it releases the oxygen. Okay, and the cycle goes on. Oxygen is being taken out, then the carbon dioxide will come or produce as the byproduct. What happened? And that carbon dioxide is being carried out, and by the help of this, it enters the blood. From the blood, it goes to the outside of the skin by which it will eliminated from the body. Okay, so cycle like this goes on. Oxygen enters and CO2 goes out or eliminated. Okay, so what happens? We discussed the oxygen is dissolved in the thin film of water. It enters into the skin, then it quietly enters into the blood capillary in which blood is present. Then what happens? In the blood, obviously the oxygen carrying pigment are present. The oxygen then bound with the oxygen carrying pigment. As soon as it bound with the oxygen carrying pigment, it becomes highly unstable. As soon as it becomes highly unstable, it enters into the tissue and releases the oxygen. Okay, oxygen goes on and the oxidation takes place, by which the carbon dioxide is being produced as a byproduct, and in the similar way the carbon dioxide is also eliminated from the body. Okay, so this much as we discussed in the case of the cutaneous respiration. The respiration is generally by the moist skin. Okay, it is generally found in the case of the earthworm, leech, some fishes, frog, etc. and also the various process as I have said you. Okay, please note down. Next, students, come to your second type of respiration, that is your branchial respiration. Okay. What happens in the case of the branchial respiration? As in the case of the cutaneous respiration, the respiration is done by the moist skin. Similarly, in the case of the branchial respiration, generally the respiration is done by the gills. So our first point, in the case of the branchial respiration, the respiration is done by the gills. Okay. So our first point, in the case of branchial respiration, it is done by the gills. Okay. Next, it is generally found in the fishes, some arthropods like prawn, some amphibia, etc. Okay. It is found in, obviously, in the fishes. As we know, in the fishes, what the respiratory organ is? Yes, the gills. In fishes, it is also found in some aquatic arthropods such as prawn, in some aquatic arthropods or arthropods such as prawn. Okay. Then in some amphibious, etc. Okay. See, next point. The gills are generally, students, it is divided into two types. One is your external gills, other one is your internal gills. We will discuss in detail what is the external gill and what is the internal gill. If we will go by the division, gills are divided into two types, students. One is your external gills, okay, and other one is your internal gills, okay. We'll have just a simple idea what is external, what is internal, and we will discuss in detail now. Simply, students, external gills means these gills are open to outside, means these are visible to the outside or visible from the outside, and they does not have any covering. Whereas in the case of the internal gills, the gills are internally placed and also are covered by a, we can say, a covering that is simply called as the operculum. So we can write the external gills. In the case of the external gills, the gills are open to outside. The gills are open to outside and are visible from outside. Okay, students. Whereas in the case of the internal gills, the gills are internally placed. The gills are internally placed. Okay. In the case of the external gills, there is no covering is present. Simply we can write the gills are not covered. But in the case of the internal gills, the gills are covered. The gills are covered. And that covering, that bony covering, is generally called as operculum. Okay. So, branchial respiration, the respiratory organ is mainly your gills. Okay. It is found in generally, obviously in the case of the fishes, in some aquatic arthropods is also found, such as your, we can say, the prawn, and also in some case of amphibians. Okay. Amphibians. Okay. Similarly, gills are divided into two types: external gills and internal gills. Gills which are open to outside and are visible from outside are called the external gills, and in the case of the internal gills, the gills are internally placed. Whereas in the case of the external gills, the gills are not covered, but in the case of the internal gills, the gills are covered by a bony covering or a structure that is called the operculum. Okay students, please note down. Now students, come to your one of the type of gills, that is your external gills. As we discussed that the gills are of two types, external gills and the internal gills. The external gills, as those are open to outside and have no covering, okay, or we can say these are placed outside, or we can say placed means these are open to outside and it can be visible from the outside, not placed outside. These are open to outside and are visible from the outside, and these are not covered. Okay, so in the case of the external gill students, these are having the various, we can say the structure is quite simple. The external gills are simple in structure and ectodermal in origin. Remember students, we discussed in the triple blastic means what? It having the all the three germ layers, ectoderm, endoderm and the mesoderm. Obviously means three germ layers, from the, you always remember, from the three germ layers only the complete organism has been evolved. Some germ layer will give rise to some organs, this particular germ layer will give rise to this particular organs or various organs. So similarly, the external gills are always derived from the ectoderm. That is why it is written that the external gills are ectodermal in origin, means it was derived or origined from the ectoderm. Okay, so your first point, these are simple in structure, external gills are simple in structure, and are ectodermal in origin. Okay, next, where these external gills are generally found? These are generally found in some annelids, some amphibia, in the tadpole larva, some bony fishes, and also in some young insects. Okay, so these are found, it is found in some annelids, some amphibians, some young insects, okay, some bony fishes, and obviously in the tadpole larva Okay, next point students, in the case of the external gills, these external gills are, we can say, vascular membranous extension on which the gaseous exchange surface is present. Okay, so we can write our next point. First I'll write, then I'll make you understand. The external gills are vascular, I'll make you understand, don't worry, vascular membranous extension having gas exchange surface. Okay, see students, the external gills, you can see here, this one is an example of the tadpole larva having the external gills. The external gills are vascular, or we can say vascularized. What do you mean by vascular? Vascular means students, you can simply write here having high blood supply. You can write high blood supply. Okay, Obviously, blood supply should be there by which the respiration could be done or the gaseous exchange should be done. These external gills are the vascular membranous extension, means these are, we can say, some sort of extension on which the gaseous surface is present, or we can say for the gaseous exchange the surface is present on which the gaseous exchange of the oxygen and the carbon dioxide can takes place. Okay. Then your next point is these external gills, you can see these external gills are bathed, or we can say surrounded by the water, okay, by which we can say the gaseous exchange takes place. Obviously, this one is your aquatic, this simply remain in the water. We can tell students that these external gills are surrounded or bathed. Bath means what? Generally we can say simply it is surrounded by the water. Okay, so our next point is the external gills bath with the, we can say, bath with the surrounding water by which the gaseous exchange takes place, or the gaseous exchange of the CO2 or and the O2 takes place. We can write our next point, the external gills bath with the surrounding water, where the gaseous exchange means simply oxygen and carbon dioxide takes place. Okay, takes place. Okay, students, means the external gills are bath. Bath means what? Simply we can say surrounded by the water, from which it takes the, we can say, the dissolved oxygen and it further act as the mode of the respiration. Okay, so the external gills are surrounded by the water by which the gaseous exchange, such as your O2 means the oxygen and the CO2 means carbon dioxide, takes place. So these are some general points. External gills are simple in structure and are ectodermal in origin. It is basically found in the some annelids, some amphibians, some young insects, some bony fishes, and also obviously in the tadpole larva, as I have taken the example. Okay, we can see here. External gills are vascular, means having the high blood supply. Vascular membranous extension, okay, having the gas exchange surface. Okay, obviously having the gas exchange surface means the gaseous exchange can takes place. External gills simply bath with the surrounding water, means it is surrounded by the water by which the gaseous exchange takes place, means gaseous exchange means simply the O2 and the CO2. Okay, so this is all about your external gills. Okay, please note down. Next, students, will discuss about the internal gills. Okay, as we discussed in the external gills, those were simple in structure, but in the case of the internal gills, these are somehow we can say complex in structure. Okay, students, so we can write our next point. First point, these are complex in structure. Okay, you can see here the diagram. It is somehow we can say it is complex in structure, and the gills are arranged in such a manner that it looks like a pages of the book. Okay, next, in the external gills, in the internal gills, these internal gills are being covered by a bony structure called the operculum, okay, which forms the gill chamber. Okay, so our next point, internal gills are covered by a bony structure called the operculum, forming the gill chamber. Okay, in the fishes. Okay, internal gills we can write in the fishes, it will be more appropriate. Internal gills in the fishes, in the, we can write in the fishes. You might have seen in the case of the fishes, the internal gills are being covered by a bony like structure that is called the operculum. Obviously, as it covers a chamber, obviously that is why the gill chamber is being formed. Next point, as I said you, the gills are arranged in such a way that it looks like a pages of the book. You mark any gill, you can observe that it looks like the pages of the book. Okay, so our next point is the gills are arranged in such a manner that it looks like pages of book. Okay. Next point, these are well vascularized, means what? Having the high blood supply. So we can write our next point, well vascularized. Okay. Next point, on the either side of the fishes, okay, the gill arc are present. Okay, the gill arc from which the gill filament arises. So we can write our next point, on the either side of the fishes, gill arcs arises. Okay, gill arcs means you can see this one, the gill arcs from which the gill filament will be arises. Next point, from each gill arc, two gill filaments arises. You can see here, from each gill arc, two gill filaments arises. From each gill arc, two gill filaments arises. Okay. Next point, tip of the adjacent gill filament arcs are arranged in such a way that it looks like a sieve like structure, okay, through which the water passes. What is our next point? The tip of the gill filament arcs are arranged in such a manner that it looks like sieve, or we can say it looks like sieve like structure. Sieve like structure. Okay, see, the tip of the gill filament arc means this portion. Okay, these are arranged in such a way, or we can say this one, these are arranged in such a way that it looks like a sieve like structure. Sieve means what? We have seen some utensils by which we generally fry the, we can say in the oil, you can see, or basically the portion, the thing by which we purify the, we can say the tea, that net like structure. Okay, that similar structure is how we can say the sieve like structure. Okay, the tip of the gill filament arcs are reduced, or we can say these are arranged in such a way that it forms the sieve like structure. Okay, next point, the gill filaments, or we can say the gill filaments, the gills, or the, we can say the internal gills are, we can say these are well vascularized by which the blood flow takes place. Obviously, as the blood flow takes place and the water also flow takes place, yes, another point is present. Tip of the gill filament arcs are arranged in such a manner that it looks like sleeve-like structure through which the water passes. Through which the water passes. As I said, it is a net-like structure through which it makes easy to pass the water. Through which water passes. Okay. Now we have seen two things. Water is passing, and it is highly well vascularized, means high blood supply is present. Obviously, there are two directions. Means one direction blood is flowing and another direction the water is flowing. Always remember the direction of the water, flow of water, and the direction of the flow of blood is opposite in direction, which makes easy for the gaseous exchange. Okay, so our last point under the internal gills, the direction of flow of water and direction of flow of blood is opposite, which makes easy for the gaseous exchange. Gaseous, or we can write O2 and CO2 exchange. Okay, students. So the direction of the flow of water and the direction of the flow of the blood is opposite. Okay, is opposite, which makes easy for the gaseous exchange. Okay, the blood flow and the water flow is opposite to each other, which makes it easy. Okay, by which the gaseous exchange makes easy, or we can say it makes easy for the gaseous exchange, means the O2 is receiving and the CO2 is being eliminated. Okay, so we discussed so many points. These are highly complex in structure. Internal gills in the fish are covered by a bony structure called the operculum, forming the gill chamber. The gills are arranged in such a manner that it looks like the pages of the books. Well vascularized means highly blood supply is present. On the either side of the fishes, gill arcs are present. From each gill arc, two gill filaments arises. You can see from each gill arc, two gill filaments arises, having the gill lamella. Okay, simply it helps in the respiration process only, nothing extra. Next point, from each gill arc, two gill filaments arises. Tip of the gill filament arcs. The tip of the gill filament arcs are arranged in such a manner, or we can say these are arranged in the reduced manner. Okay, these are arranged in the reduced manner to have a sieve-like structure. Means what? The net-like structure by which the water can easily pass through. Okay. Lastly, the direction of the flow of the water and the direction of the flow of the blood is opposite to each other, by which it makes easy for the gaseous exchange, or we can say by which the oxygen is being received and the carbon dioxide is being eliminated. Okay, is opposite, it will be better you write is opposite to each other, opposite to each other, it will be more prominent. The direction of the flow of water and direction of the flow of blood is opposite to each other, which makes easy for the gaseous exchange. Okay, students, so you can see here the diagram also where we have drawn. These are your gill arcs from the adjacent side where the gill filament arises, looks like pages of the book, having the gill arc. This one gill arc I have done it separately. From the gill arc, two gill filaments arises, each having the gill lamella, and this all structure compositely helps in the, we can say, the respiration process or carrying out the respiration process. Okay, students. So please note down the internal gills. Next, students, lastly, the type of the gills in the case of the bony fish and in the case of the cartilaginous fish. In the bony fish, the type of the gill is your, we can say, the filiform gills or the pectinate gills, whereas in the case of the cartilaginous fish, the type of gill is your lamelli branch gills. How is the structure of the bony fish gills? The gill filaments are attached to the branchial septum, or we can say these are attached to the reduced branchial septum having the free distal ends. The gill filaments are attached to the reduced branchial septum having free distal ends. Okay, whereas in the case of the cartilaginous fish, the gill lamella is attached throughout the septum. Okay, the gill lamella is attached throughout the length of the septum. Okay, means what? In the case of the filiform, we can say filiform gills, as we have discussed, like this the gill arch is present, and this one is your, we can say, the gill filaments. Means the gill filaments are, we can say, it is attached to the reduced branchial septum having the free distal ends. Whereas in the case of the lamellae branch, the gill lamella are arranged in such a manner. Okay, you can see these are the gill lamella which are attached throughout the septum. Okay, you can see here it have the free distal ends, but in this case the gill lamella are attached throughout the septum. Okay, so students, we discussed in the bony fish gills it have the filiform type of or the pectinate gills, whereas in the cartilaginous fish it have the lamellae branch gills. So students, we discussed today the types of respiration on the basis of the presence of the respiratory organ. First, we discussed the cutaneous respiration, in which the respiratory organ is basically the moist skin. And in the case of the, we can say, the branchial respiration, the respiratory organ is generally the gills. The gills is further divided into two types. One is your internal gills and other one is your external gills. The internal gills are being placed inside, whereas the external gills, or we can say it is open to the outside. Simply, in the case of the external gills, okay, in the case of the external gills there is no covering, but in the case of the internal gills it is covered by a bony structure called the operculum. Okay students, don't confuse. In the case of the internal gills, these are internally placed. In the case of the external gills, these are open to outside and visible to outside. In the case of the internal gills, it is covered by a bony structure called operculum, whereas in the case of the external gills, it is not being covered. Okay, further we discuss so many points under the internal gills and also so many points under the external gills. And lastly, in the bony fish, the type of gill is your, we can say, the filiform or the pectinate gill, and in the case of the cartilaginous fish, the type of gill is your lamellae branch gills. Okay, so that's all for today. We will meet in our next class. Thank you.